Hello, welcome to Irwin Data Modeler Tool Training and your first course, Introduction to Irwin Data Modeler. In this course, you'll learn what is where on the Irwin user interface. We'll examine the interface that is installed, but you'll find that you can tailor the interface to fit your needs and preferences. We will also work with the product to get you started working with entities and tables, columns and attributes, relationships and views. In the first module, let's take a look at the user interface from the top of the screen down to the bottom. I'll do my best not to read every slide out loud. In my experience, that interferes with understanding. You're ready? Here we go. As Irwin installs, once you know what is where with the default installation, you'll find that customizing opportunities to be easy and excellent. Irwin installs busy so that the existing users can go right to work. We'll point out some of the customizing that's possible. The largest single chunk of the desktop is the workspace. This is where diagrams are displayed and where you can do on-screen editing. At the bottom left, see the entire Irwin desktop with the workspace highlighted in red? On the upper right, we've zoomed into the workspace. This is the general approach we'll use with slides in this class. Now, working from the top down, don't forget the title bar. Irwin lets you have several models open at once. The title bar tells you what model you're seeing right now. It also shows you where you are in that model. See the word logical at the right end? With the asterisk showing, we know that we have changed the model, but we haven't yet saved those changes. The menu bar in Irwin Data Modeler is typical of Windows applications. Most of the Irwin magic happens in the middle of the menu bar: Diagram, Model, Actions, and Tools. You can choose which toolbars to show. You can undock any toolbar and just let it float wherever you like. Or you can dock it in some other location. I usually place a couple of my favorite toolbars vertically on the screen, so you can control the real estate that you have in the workspace. We'll get a look at how some of that is done. There's a special toolbar called the Irwin Toolbox. The toolbox is a set of buttons that we'll be using a lot. The View menu is all about what you want to see in the interface and the most basic settings of how the interface or the diagram will look. In the View menu, you'll see a submenu, Toolbars. And this submenu lists all the available toolbars and their current visibility. If the toolbar is checked, then it will be visible in the screen. Irwin features several panels or panes. One pane you'll surely be using is the Model Explorer. The Explorer gets you to model objects in a familiar tree structure. Some panes have their own toolbars. That's true of the Model Explorer. Usually there's a special quick access to context-sensitive help, as with the Model Explorer, that little book with a question mark on it. Buttons in the Model Explorer let you retrace your steps, search the tree, even delete model objects. Be careful deleting. Model objects in Irwin almost never stand alone. Typically, a model object will affect many other model objects. You'll notice that the branches of the tree, as well as the contents of each branch, appear in alphabetical order. Note the two tabs at the bottom of the Model Explorer. For now, we're going to keep focus on the entire model, but later, in Module 2 of this course, you'll learn about subject areas. Everything a user does in the current session is tracked in the action log. Tracked actions even include repositioning an object in the diagram. In addition to straightforward, simple undo and redo from the top down, the action log lets us skip back to something you did maybe 2 hours ago and maybe dozens of operations ago. We can reach back there. You can search, first of all, for the action that you wish you hadn't taken. Reach back into this tree and undo that one particular action. Back it out. Irwin also understands how that action might have affected other things, and it will adjust everything accordingly. We don't have to undo the dozens or 100 actions that you've taken since you made that mistake. and then redo all of them manually. We could just reach back into the tree and unplug the action we want to remove. When you close your model, the session is over, and that clears out the action log. You come back to that model, you'll have a brand new action log. The advisories pane is another pane, and it comments about potential issues with the work you're doing in Irwin. A handy feature is that you can print or save the advisories to a file outside the model. The overview pane is an extremely handy navigation device. It lets you position the current diagram inside the workspace, and it lets you zoom in. So we see the overall Irwin desktop at the bottom left, and up at the top left, we have zoomed in to the overview pane. In the medium blue box, we've highlighted a chunk that we want to work on, want to appear in the workspace. And you see the immediate effect at the bottom right of this slide. So we can position and zoom in the current diagram inside the workspace by seeing what's around the current workspace contents. Very nice. Just as with toolbars, you'll find a list of available panes in the View menu. It's in the Windows submenu. As Irwin installs, the only pane that's not visible on the desktop is the bulk editor. The bulk editor is incredibly powerful, but it's for the more advanced Irwin user and is certainly beyond the scope of this course. We will cover it in other Irwin tool training courses. However, you'll notice that I've mentioned a few items of the user interface that we will cover in depth in some other course or later in this course. I want you to be secure that we will cover these items. Well, we've worked our way from the top all the way down to the status bar. Just like the title bar, the status bar is easy to forget, easily ignored. But it contains some very valuable information, especially the target database management system. And one that I forget all the time is a zoom bar over at the right end. You can grab the little lever in the middle and slide to the left to zoom out and slide to the right to zoom in. It's a very handy control, but out of sight, out of mind. So hopefully it won't be out of your mind now. Well, with some judicious repositioning and with use of Windows pinning, and I've circled the pin control buttons with the red circles on this screen. Using pinning, you can remodel your Irwin desktop. So if, for example, we were to pin the Model Explorer, the left side of the desktop, the Explorer itself would no longer appear in all its glory. It would be left to a tab showing down the left side of the screen, a small tab. So you can really open up the workspace, and you can take the workspace to wherever you would like to take it. It's very customizable and really is state-of-the-art. Here's an example of what I was talking about. This is actually from an earlier version of Irwin, but just to show you that this capability has been around for a while. This is release 8, so the appearance is a little different. The title bar is set up a little bit differently. Status bar is a little bit different. But the customizing, you see toolbars. We don't have the toolbars that we had shown in the default installation. This user has seen fit to turn off some of the toolbars that they don't use frequently. They still have access to those controls, at least through the menus. And the panes, there's the Explorer way over on the left. That's now a pull-out pane because it's been pinned to the application. And on the right, we see our action log and other panes that have been pinned to the interface. Well, look what happens. And the bulk editor is down at the bottom left. Look what happens to the workspace. So instead of having to feel like you're working through a keyhole someplace, building a ship in a bottle, you can expand the workspace to give you a lot of room to work. You're not always going to be zoomed out, so you need a magnifying glass in front of your screen. So we've completed our first objective for the course, and that's it for Module 1. In Module 1, we looked at the control aspects of Irwin Data Modeler. Now in Module 2, we're going to take a look at the workspace. You have a beginning understanding of the user interface, and you've seen that the greatest area, the greatest piece of real estate in the Irwin desktop is the workspace, where we see and work on diagrams. We need to dig into that a little bit. Remember that Irwin Data Modeler can work with models that include a single entity table up to thousands of model objects. The tool must have ways to treat the model so that the modeler can focus on issues of interest and not have to struggle working with the entire model on the screen at the same time. That brings us to the user-controllable workspace environment. Data modelers often use the terms model and diagram as synonyms, but they really are not. First of all, data models contain lots of information that's just not graphical. It can't be displayed in any diagram. The diagram may be the single most important part of the model, but it's not the whole model. And that's important to realize. With real-world models, presenting all the graphical model objects on the screen at one time would probably show just an unintelligible mess, just a web of lines and dots. Still, the model is a necessary holding place for all details of the business information requirements, the database objects, the model's history, even details about the project during which the model was constructed and projects in which the model is used. We need a way to focus on the important pieces of the models important to us at this time, sometimes changing focus, if only for the temporary convenience of the modeler. Remember those two tabs at the bottom of the Model Explorer? We saw these back in Module 1. The model contains everything, and that includes all entities. Well, we've highlighted here a number of entities, but we'd have to scroll down to see all of them. The point is the model contains all of the entities and all of everything else. For purposes we'll see later, it's handy to have one subject area set up to include the entire model. But setting that aside for a minute, I'd like you to think about subject areas as subsets of the model. They're not required, but they surely are helpful. They help us see smaller chunks of the big forest, and that makes it easier to do the right work on the right trees in the forest. Remember that the Model Explorer allows us to switch focus from the entire model to a single subject area. Just a few slides back, we looked at the entire model and we looked at the entities in the entire model, a lot of them. Here we've selected the Subject Areas tab at the bottom of the Model Explorer, and now we're looking at the contents of that tab. Up at the top, you can see from the selection list, this model includes 3 subject areas. By the way, this model is available to you when you've installed Irwin. It's the Publications Application sample model. We have 3 subject areas in this model. One subject area, called Model with carets around it, includes everything in the model. Then we have a subject area which is a subset. It's called Application Views, and another subject area which is a subset of the whole model. That one's called Book. And you can see in the highlight at the top of the drop-down list, we're looking at Book right now. Remember, the model is the entire model, even when you have a subject area called Model. Right now, Book is the subject area that is active in the tree, and look at the set of entities contained in Book. There's only 5 of them, compared to the dozen or 15 or so that we could see without scrolling down a couple of slides ago. So the Book subject area includes only a few entities, the ones that make sense when we're dealing with books. The subject area Book does not duplicate the Book entity, the Book YTD sales, or these others. You will see them in the full model, but these are not duplicates. The subject area is just a very sophisticated filter. There are no duplicated objects. The subject area is filtering the presentation for us, and it's also filtering the effects of the modeling decisions that we make using Irwin Data Modeler. Now we'll take a look at diagrams. Notice in our little circles over here that subject areas that we have shown here, subject area A and subject area B, are subsets of the overall model. Subject area A and subject area B overlap a little bit. Remember that a subject area could be as large as the whole model, could include everything that the model includes, but usually not. You'll have one like that in the model, but you may have many subject areas in that same model. So we can think of subject areas primarily as subdividing the model into workable chunks. Diagrams can be used to subdivide a subject area into workable chunks. That's what diagram 1 and diagram 2 do here in our little picture. Diagram 3 exists outside of a subject area. That's okay. The model itself can have diagrams. Just because a particular entity appears in several subject areas or in several diagrams, there's only one single instance of it, and that is in the model. Just as the subject areas don't duplicate model objects, neither do diagrams. Diagrams are just another level of filtering. Each subject area has a discrete set of diagrams. So subject area A could have diagrams called diagram 1 and diagram 2 also. They don't interact. Diagrams, again, are discrete in a subject area. They are unique to that subject area. Each subject area has its own set of diagrams, another way of saying the same thing. Each diagram exhibits a complete set of presentation options. We're going to take a look at some examples of this. In our book subject area, this is the diagram labeled Entity. You'll see that Entity tab at the bottom of this diagram, along with others. We're going to step through the 5 diagrams here and take a look at them and ask the question, well, why would we have such a thing? In this diagram called Entity, each of the entities is represented as a rectangular box with the name of the entity inside the box. Notice the background is a solid light gray color. Also some notes at the right about the entity diagram. We see the target audience, and we see at least a piece of the definition of this diagram. But where did I get that? That's actually saved in this model. And if you open up the Publications Application Model, the example model that installs with Irwin, Data Modeler, you will see that this tab, this diagram, has this information stored in the diagram. So this kind of metadata can be saved in the model. And there's several ways of doing that. We'll look at some of them when we get into the next course, building your first Irwin data model. Our next diagram, looking at the tabs along the bottom of the diagrams. Entity definition. Well, it's a very different appearance. Here, the background for the diagram, it looks like grid paper. Each entity is represented by a box with the title of the entity above the box. But look what's inside the box. A definition of the entity. Our next diagram is logical. The background is light blue. I think, in fact, it might be a gradient. Inside each entity box, now we see a list of attribute names. Notice also that the foreign keys are red. That's actually something that is done automatically if we prepare Irwin Data Modeler to do it. And that can be a property of the diagram. So for this diagram, logical, we have said, I want foreign keys to be shown in red. Our fourth diagram, the physical diagram, has a solid medium gray background. Here, though, each box represents not an entity, but a table in the database. And in fact, up here near the top right, this is a database view. Database views don't even exist on the logical side of the model. So in this potential or existing database, this representation of a diagram called physical, we see inside the box the name of the column and some information about that column, some properties of the column, the data type, and we also see that column's participation in key groups called inversion entries. These are non-unique key groups. Our fifth and final diagram is called physical index. A very specific purpose. This has got a solid medium blue background. Again, the boxes represent tables, but we don't display now the column data types. The column names are displayed. Foreign keys are still red. Well, the question is, why do we have 5 tabs? Because it suits our needs and our purposes. Well, how did we pick medium blue? Or how did we pick that blue on yellow grid for backgrounds? Maybe we found it suitable for our target audience. Some target audiences may be captured by the visual display. You need to show a diagram to people who aren't familiar with working with these diagrams all the time, with different amounts of detail and maybe a different presentation style than you would to a group of database administrators or people who are used to working in the details of databases. So we select the characteristics of the diagram to suit our intended audience and our intended purpose. A set of diagrams is contained in a subject area. Each of those diagrams we've just looked at are contained in a subject area called Book. Subject areas subdivide the model and allow us to keep our attention just on the entities and tables that are in that subject area. Remember, when we set up our subject area, we're controlling not just what we see in the workspace, but also what we see in the Model Explorer. So we can greatly reduce the size of that tree that we're having to deal with in the Model Explorer. The diagram, or diagrams, are unique to a subject area. Each diagram could include everything that's in the subject area, but it doesn't have to. It can include less than the subject area. You might have a subject area, as we have, with 5 entities in it, but one of those diagrams may have only 3 entities. It depends on what you need to present. Similarly, the subject areas are generally subsets of the model. They could include the entire model. Diagrams must exist, otherwise you have nothing to look at. Subject areas don't have to exist. We can have diagrams that are just pertaining to the model itself, everything in the model, without subject areas. Subject areas, though, are extremely useful. And that brings us to our next objective in Module 2, using themes effectively. All those color schemes that we saw in the example diagrams may be chosen to suit a target audience or a particular level of detail or familiarity with the subject. Do you mean that for every diagram I'm going to have to go in and adjust all these properties? And believe me, there are many, many more properties of a diagram than the few that we've looked at. No. Irwin Data Modeler wouldn't make you do that. Themes give us a way to create named sets of those display options, those diagram options, the ones that we've looked at, and many, many others. Themes make reuse of these options easy and standardized and reusable. Isn't it all about standardizing things? If we can make the standards, then the modeler will be happy to use the standards. We don't have to complain, well, they just don't use the standards. Well, they will if they benefit the modeler. If they help the modeler do better work and do more work, the modeler's all for it. Here we see gathered together on one page all 5 of those diagrams from our book subject area. For each diagram, we've chosen which objects to include and which details to show for those objects and how to present them. Fonts and colors, the level of detail that we want to show. Do we just want to see the name of the entity inside the box? Do we want to see a definition inside the box? Do we want to see a list of all the attributes inside the box? Background patterns, lots and lots of details. Not to mention, well, which items of the subject area do we want to display in this particular diagram? That's why we have themes, because we can set up a theme and use it for as many diagrams as we'd like. There will be some of these diagrams that we're going to use frequently in many of our subject areas. Logical or entity definition, physical. I can imagine using those in practically every subject area. But wouldn't it be nice to set up the diagram one time by means of a theme and then just attach that theme over and over again to whatever diagrams? And that's how themes work. Remember our friend the View menu? We used it before to look at the Toolbars submenu and the Windows submenu. Now we're going to look at the View menu choice, Themes, all the way at the bottom. So along with the specific details, you should be getting a feel for the kinds of things we'll find in the View menu at least. There are lots of kinds of model objects in Irwin, including themes. Every one of those model objects has an editor that we will eventually get to in this series on Irwin Data Modeler tool training. This is the theme editor, And I want you just to notice, first of all, the quick access to the names of the themes and default fonts and fills and colors and the foreign key attribute color. There's a whole separate property for that. Look at the tabs. And I will promise you, all these tabs have got a list of properties, as we see here on the Defaults tab to the left. But just look at the tab names in the list over here at the right. These are all the different kinds of things for which we have properties that we can set up in a theme. You see here in the theme editor, themes will go way beyond font and color choices. Properties of any object can be overridden for emphasis. Notice our tabs: entity, attribute, relationship. Themes promote easy use and standardization. Just open up the diagram and attach a theme. Don't have the theme you need, make a new one, but make sure that gets implemented in your Irwin standards. And yes, we will see how to do that. Not in this course. We can't get it all at one time. Note the tab labeled Where Used. That's going to show a list of the diagrams in the current model and subject area where this theme is used. The highlighted theme, classic theme, is highlighted at the top. So if we would click on the Where Used tab, you'd get a list of all the diagrams in this model where the selected theme is assigned. This is extremely handy. If you change the layout, change the properties of a theme, you'll probably want to revisit all those diagrams and make sure, oh gee, I made the entity boxes bigger. I have to go back and move some things around. You'll find similar tabs in lots of places in Irwin Data Modeler. Your effective use of themes will serve you across different projects, different audiences, different kinds of models, different diagram purposes. Standardization and reuse. Beautiful ideas, well implemented. Well, that's it for Module 2. You should now understand the workspace paradigm, also called the model subject area diagram paradigm, how these things work together. And you should understand how we can use themes effectively throughout an Irwin data model to control the appearance and the presentation of the diagrams in a useful, repeatable, reusable way. So let's get started. We begin with a look at how Irwin handles the fundamentals of creating a blank model. Of course, you wouldn't be here if you didn't know how to create a new file in the Windows environment. But we need to look at some special issues. By the way, in these demonstrations, in practice you may do what I do outside of class. I use the toolbar buttons. However, here, I think it's easier for you to follow along, easier for you to see, if I use menus most of the time. Let's look at the process of creating a new Irwin data model. Generally, it's the leftmost button on the top row of toolbars, the little document icon with a sunburst in the top left corner. But as I mentioned, I would prefer to use the menus because it's easier for you to see and to follow along. So from the File menu, I'm going to select New. Well, we have to know something about our model right off the bat. Notice that Irwin can create models which are logical only. They have no physical side. Irwin can also create models that are physical only. They have no logical side. The classic approach with Irwin is to build a model with both logical and physical information in a single model. And the fourth choice, Match Template. So notice the target server set of options here in the dialog. Match Template Target Server. The reason that we need those will be more apparent as we go along. Drop down a list of choices for databases. These are database management systems, and we have quite a range. SQL Server is fine, we'll leave it at that. Once you've chosen the DBMS on the left, you'll have a populated version list on the right. We'll take the latest available SQL Server, which is 2016. Now, what about these templates? Notice right now we're seeing the default template, but that is a drop-down list. Let me pull it down. Oh, we only have one template. Templates are really amazing. and we will cover their use in detail in the course on advanced data modeling techniques. A template is nothing more than an already built Irwin DM model, but it has everything in it that you want most of your models, or all of your models of a particular kind, to contain, already built. So you have a beginning understanding of themes, at least from our Introduction to Irwin Data Modeler course, and we can have a lot of themes. How about I have a model that has all the themes in it that I'm ever going to want? Well, I can remove from that model all of the entities, all of the tables, all of the attributes, all of the columns, all of everything that I don't need in a template, and just leave an empty Irwin model with a full set of my standard themes. I can save that as a template. I can use that with other models. I can share it with a modeling team. We can develop standardized templates for the organization. That's a wonderful thing. But that's it. We're going to build an Irwin Classic model. That's the logical and physical together, targeting SQL Server 2016. And based on the only template we have right now, default, push the OK button at the bottom right. Here we are. Let me maximize the diagram window within the workspace. I notice a couple of things. Down at the bottom left corner of the workspace, see the tab? That's a diagram tab. So even though we did not create a diagram, Irwin has built one for us. This is indicative of the fact that we cannot view anything in an Irwin model, a diagrammatic thing, except through a diagram. So now we have a default diagram. We'll see later on how to change the name and change the location and so forth of this diagram. But that is how we create a new model in Irwin Data Modeler. Already you have a hint of things to come. Once I've started a new model, I want to get it saved immediately. This establishes the file name and the location for my new model and makes periodic saving simple. Well, here's our brand new dandy Irwin DM data model. Let's save it right away. Once again, we go to the File menu. Note that File Save has the hotkey combination that's so familiar to Windows users. We want to do a file Save As. And I'm going to put this in the desktop in a little folder I have called Class. And I'm going to call it Course 02 Mod for Model 01. It's going to have the extension .irwin. Do I have any choices there? I do. We're actually working with release 9.8 here. So I can save it to a file format from the previous version, going back to 9.64.02, 9.64. I can save it as an Irwin DM template. Remember, we were just talking about Irwin templates? I can save it to XML in a sort of minimized way, or a standard XML file, or an XML file with all repository kinds of information in it. And that opens up a number of opportunities. We're going to stick with the default star.irwin, the Irwin DM extension, and save. Very well. End of that little demo. Admittedly, we don't have much of a model, but at least we captured it. As our work progresses, we'll want to save it frequently. Here's how. Well, working with the tools so far in this module, we have created a new model, an Irwin DM model. We have used Save As, the name, and all those choices that we have about what kind of a model we want. And now we can see that, well, as we're working along with the model, what can I tell? Way back up at the top in the title bar, notice we have the name of the model, Course 02 Mod 01.irwin. Then a colon, then the name of the diagram that we're looking at, ER Diagram 163, and that matches the name on the tab at the bottom left corner of the workspace. There is no asterisk following the name of the diagram, so we know we have no unsaved changes. Take a look at the Model Explorer and you'll see that our model has been given a name. It's a default name. Well, why would it default to something like Model _1? Because it doesn't know what we want it to be named. But it's important to note that the model name is not the same as the file name. Doesn't have to be. I like the model name to be a little more descriptive. And as we work with the Model Explorer, we'll see how to do that. We want to save our work whenever we close the model or exit from Irwin Data Modeler. And this will present us a dialog with some unique capabilities. I can close with the Close Window button, the little X box button at the top right, or from the File menu, Close. I didn't have any changes to that model, so let me reopen it. Notice now down at the bottom of the File menu, Course 02, Mod 01, Irwin, the most recent one. It's opened. I want to change the name of the model right in here in the Model Explorer, and I'm just going to name it Demo. That's not the name of the file, it's the name of the model. I like to think of the model name as being a more logical name for the model, rather than having our file naming standards at work. Suddenly, look at the title bar, we have our asterisk at the far right end. Means we do have unsaved changes. Let me forget to save, and instead select File Close from the menus. And here is my File Close dialog. Irwin allows us to have multiple models open. Since I'm just trying to save a model, or trying to close a model rather, I only have one item on the list. But if I had several models open in Irwin, and I was exiting Irwin, I'd see a list appear. Notice the check mark box at the left end and that button picture in the row at the top. That's a save icon, isn't it? If you can see that tiny little thing. So if I check this box, changes that I've made in the demo model, that's the model name, and you see the file name beside it. Demo has an asterisk, so would the file name. Model path, that's where it goes. Do I want to save this change or not? Let me think about that for a minute. In the toolbar at the top of the Save Models, let's explore these other options, which would make a big difference if we were trying to exit Irwin with many models open. Let's look at the second button in the toolbar, second from the left. Little tooltip pops up, Invert. Selected rows become unselected and vice versa. Well, I only have one row. Of course, it's selected. But if I were trying to exit Irwin with multiple models open, then I could Control-click or Shift-click through that list for the models I wanted to close. This button inverts that selection. See how it turned off my highlight? Then there's a File button. I can use that to change the directory. If I were connected to a MART, running in a database where my Irwin models would be saved as data in a relational database, I could browse for a path to that MART, and there's a little help file. I don't need to save this model, so the next time I open it, it won't say Demo up there. Okay, so closing the model gives me a dialog to save the model if I have made changes. Let me open that model again, File, Course 02 Mod 01. That's the name of the file, not the name of the model. And our model name is back to the original defaulted Model _ 1, not the demo that we changed it to, because I told Irwin, hey, when you close that, don't bother to save it first. So that's saving our model using File, Save, menu choice, and also saving the model if we had changes made between this time and the previous time we saved it. Okay, by creating a new blank data model, saving it as something, just saving it, closing it, or exiting the tool doesn't seem like a big deal. But the dialogues hint at some interesting things to come. Also, if we don't get this stuff right, all of our great modeling work will be for nothing. Now, with those zero-level tasks taken care of, let's get to the actual data modeling in Irwin Data Modeler. Module 4 will cover the on-screen building blocks, essentially the basics of working with Irwin DM. Remember the special toolbar we called the Irwin Data Modeler Toolbox? We can do lots of work with that little stack of buttons right in the workspace. This is called on-screen editing. If a data model is no more than boxes and lines, well, let's start with some boxes. Our project has identified a few things of interest. Actually, these are sets of people, places, things, concepts, or events about which we need to remember important details. I hope that definition sounds familiar. We need to get the names right and to agree on a short, basic definition. Note book YTD sales. YTD here is an acronym for year to date. We need to know over what period the year to date. Is that a fiscal year, a calendar year? We're going to assume it's a calendar year. Here we are in Irwin Data Modeler, ready to make some entities and tables. I'm going to begin with a model that we created and saved. Down at the bottom of the file menu, you see the most recent models that have been opened. There, number 1, that's the one we want. Course 02 mod 01.Irwin. Exactly what we had. Emptiness. I mentioned I'm going to use the menus as much as I can, but right now I want to talk about some toolbars specifically. Number 1 is the Irwin toolbox. I'm going to hover around this clockwise and go slide back and forth across it so you can see it at the top of your screen. The leftmost button in the Irwin DM toolbox is a select arrow. Then we have the new entity button, a subcategory relationship, an identifying or solid line relationship, many-to-many relationship, non-identifying relationship, annotation, and a continuous line. Let's push the new entity button and begin our work. Watch what happens to the cursor now. As I see, it's still the selection arrow, but I've pushed the new entity button. And now as I move the cursor down onto the diagram, watch what happens to the cursor. The cursor image has changed. I see a blank entity, just a box with 2 regions defined inside. And I see a little starburst or sunburst at the top left corner. Irwin consistently uses symbols like this to mean a new something. In this case, it's a new entity. I just left-click the mouse, and there's our new entity. That might be small on your screen. Let me zoom in a bit. I can use the toolbars. There's a zoom toolbar that I have turned on. From the View menu, there's a zoom choice. Notice all the hotkey. The Control plus Num plus means hold the Control button down while you press the plus bar in the numeric keypad. That's the zoom in, zoom out. Or I can just click on the menu choice. Control plus takes me there. Let me find myself again. Or I can use the plus zoom button to zoom in. I think that's probably enough. Remember the little book model that I laid out for you? Let's make our first entity book. Notice how Irwin has created a name already for us, E/1. Irwin just doesn't like leaving things unnamed. Also, we have all these little handles around the outside of the box. Irwin entity boxes will be automatically sized. You can manually resize them, which turns off the automatic resizing. Let's leave the automatic resizing on. I want to type in all uppercase now, the word book, B, and notice, since the Irwin Data Modeler entity was highlighted, just begin typing replaces that default name with the name that I want, which is book. My cursor image is back to the select arrow. Click someplace on a diagram and we're done. There's a very nice behavior of the buttons in the Irwin toolbox. This time I'm going to hold down the Control key on my keyboard and click on that new entity button. Still holding down the Control key. And click. Notice the cursor image. Click, click, click. So if you have a flurry of new entities to create, you can do them very rapidly with that little Control button hold down trick. All right, I've released the Control button. I have my select cursor back. The E/5 entity is highlighted. I'm going to select instead the E/2 entity and just begin typing in the entity name writer and hit the Enter key or click anywhere in the background. Oh, I didn't want that entity to be titled writer. I wanted it to be named author. What can I do now? Let's assume I've gone off and done other things. Well, first I come back with my cursor and click on the entity to select it. If I just start typing the word author, it replaces writer. Let me go back and show something else, though. If I want to edit the word writer, I click once to highlight the entity, and then once again to get into that region of the entity for typing in the name. And I can edit the name. I'm just going to replace it with author. I'd like to get rid of these extra E3, E4, E5 entities that I created. I'm just demonstrating something. So I could highlight one of them and delete it. I get a warning. It'd be deleted from the diagram. Do I also want them deleted from the model? Yes, I do. Remember our discussion. We talked about diagrams, subject areas, and the model. Subject area is different from a model, and a diagram is different from a subject area and from a model. I'd also like to delete E4 and E5. So I'm going to position my cursor above and to the left of E/4, press the left mouse button, and drag a lasso around those two entities. Release the left mouse button. They're both selected. And now one hit of the delete key. Answer that question affirmatively, yes, I want them deleted from the model. And they're gone. We have another way that's related to on-screen editing in that we don't have to open any of the guided editors to help us build things. We can use the Model Explorer. Expand the Model 1, the model level tree, and then expand the entities tree. You'll see we have an author entity and a book entity. Right-click on the entities tree branch, on the word entities in other words, and select New. Let's create one more entity for our model at this time, and it will be Publisher. And hit the Enter key or click out in the diagram someplace. There we go. Wait a minute. I don't see Publisher in my model. Well, actually, I do see it in my model because it's listed in the Model Explorer as an entity. What is it that I don't see Publisher within? It's the diagram. Well, let me zoom way out. So I don't see my Publisher entity appearing on this diagram at all. How can I get it there? Well, let's go back to Publisher in the Model Explorer. Right-click. Our first choice is Add to Diagram. Well, I can guess what that will do. Look what else I can do. I can grab the Publisher entity right out of the Model Explorer, pull it over here to the diagram, and drop it. I'm going to use the Zoom button now, the fourth one from the left, which is the Zoom magnifying glass with little crosshairs in it. That will zoom in to fit everything that I have in a diagram. Remember when we created our model, I said we wanted a logical and physical both. Well, let's take a look at the View menu again. Right now we're looking at the logical model, Control-Shift-L. We could take a look at the physical side of the model, either here in the menu or using Control-Shift-P, or there's another way in the toolboxes. There's a drop-down toggle for logical and physical. Let me switch over to the physical side of the model. Well, the diagram looks the same as it did before, but look at the Model Explorer. These are all the physical objects and properties that Irwin can model for SQL Server 2016. There's no entities branch. Let me scroll down here again. The branches of the tree are in alphabetical order. Scroll down to tables and expand that. There we go. So for each entity that I've created on the logical side, Irwin has built me a physical side table. Now they look the same, but they don't have to look the same. I'm going to build another entity just for a moment. I'll throw it away later. I'm on the physical side of the model, so I'm going to use the Irwin DM toolbox. Click on the New Table button on the physical side. Build a new table. I'll name it something silly like Doodad. And now I'm going to flip back over to the logical side of the model. Logical. And we see Irwin has automatically created an entity for me. How do I know? Well, it's in my list of entities for the model. So when I use the Irwin DM Toolbox tools to create things right directly on the diagram, they of course appear on the diagram. If I use the Model Explorer to create new objects, and I can create all kinds of new objects in the Model Explorer, not just entities, but when I use the Model Explorer to create new objects, they're not automatically put on the diagram because Irwin has no idea what diagram or diagrams, if any, I want this thing to appear on. We don't want doodad at any rate. I can right-click on doodad, tell it to delete, or in the diagram, I can highlight doodad, hit the delete button on the keyboard, and answer the question whether I want this deleted from the model or just from the diagram. I say yes, delete it also from the model, and it's gone. Well, that's entities and tables using the on-screen editing capabilities where we're talking about working directly on the diagram and also working in the Model Explorer. Hope you found that very interesting. Well, that's a starting set of entities. Now let's flesh out some details. We're going to use on-screen editing to create some detailed information about authors, books, etc., the attributes. Let's continue now with these three little entities, book, author, and publisher. Now we're going to add some attributes and columns to them. First, let's use on-screen editing, working right on the diagram. I have my cursor, the selection cursor. As I bring it across the top of the entity, it changes into a move cursor. I can grab that entity, drag it around as I wish. I'm just going to select the entity just by left-clicking. Now I'm going to strike the Tab key a couple of times. Notice as I continue to hit the Tab button on the keyboard, there are three regions that I can type into. The top region is the one we've worked in already, the entity name. And then, inside the top of the box, this is the region where I can type in attributes that are part of the primary key. And below the line, so-called non-key attributes. They may be parts of other keys, but they don't participate in the primary key. Let me purposely make a mistake here. I'm going to create two attributes in the bottom part of the box. Book identification. Now, if I hit the Tab button, I'm going to jump to the next region, the entity name. I don't want to do that. I want to stay in this non-key area. So I'll just hit the Enter key. And now I can type in another attribute, book name. I'm just using mixed case for attribute names here in our examples. Now I can click outside of the book entity, make some room for it, and we have an entity with two attributes. But book identification is supposed to be the primary key. So once again, I'll select the book entity. Now notice when I move my cursor into the entity name region, it's a move cursor. When I point my cursor into the primary key region, it's a move cursor. When I point my cursor into the non-key attribute region, it turns into a little grabber hand. Why? Because it's aware that there's something there already and I might want to move it. So I'm going to use my grabber hand, point it to book identification, press and hold the left mouse button, drag book identification up to above the line into the primary key area and release it. So you can see some ways in which doing this on the diagram editing is really, really handy. Now I'd like to create some attributes for, well, let's work on publisher. This time I'm going to use the Model Explorer. In the Entities branch, expand the Publisher entity. And notice it has several branches underneath, including attributes. Nothing listed here, but working very similarly to what we did when we were creating entities over here in the Model Explorer. Left-click on the Attributes branch of Publisher, right-click on it now, and say New. Notice right in the Model Explorer, we're going to be creating a new attribute. And out on the diagram, that change is going to take place. How about Publisher identification? And Enter. While we're here, let's just go ahead and create another new attribute. Point your cursor to the Attributes branch. Now pick New, Publisher Name, and Enter. Now I know using on-diagram editing, I can go to the diagram, get my grabber hand, and move Publisher Identification up into the primary key area. But we're focusing on the Model Explorer for a moment. Notice also underneath Publisher, there are other branches besides Attributes. There's a branch for key groups. Expand that. Erwin has already created a key group called XPK Publisher. This is the default way that Erwin names key groups. You can change that. We'll see that later. Not in this course. Let me expand that. And below our key group, XPK Publisher, there's a members branch, meaning what attributes are members of this key group. We don't have any. Let's go back up to my Publisher Identification attribute in the Model Explorer. Grab that, press and hold the left mouse button. Drag it down into the members branch of XPK Publisher. Drop it. So that's not allowed. What if I right-click on members? No. So there are some things that you can't do in the Model Explorer. That's okay. We'll just go back to the diagram, select Publisher, grab Publisher Identification, and move it up to above the line. We're going to avoid all those problems with the author entity. Select, hit the Tab button. We're in the primary key region of the entity box. And let's create the primary key attribute, author identification. That's our only primary key attribute. I'm ready to move to the non-key section. So I need the Tab button. And this is very standard kind of Windows behavior. And I'll create the new non-key attribute called author name. And click any place on the diagram. Book name, publisher name, author name. I'm going to have a lot of attributes that are names of things, aren't I? Wouldn't it be handy if I could create ahead of time a kind of a reusable attribute for something name? We're going to see in the advanced modeling course that indeed we can do that. Let's see what's been going on the physical side of our model. Yes, indeed, Erwin has been creating a physical side of our model. We now have tables for every entity and columns for every attribute. The only difference that I see is on the physical side, those spaces are filled in by the underbar character. Why? Because by default, Erwin will not allow spaces in physical names. I'm not going to be naming a column Publisher Identification. It might be PUBLID or something like that. Well, okay, later in other courses, we're going to show you how to change the way that Erwin creates physical side objects to match the existing logical side object. It's been a while since I saved the model. Let me go back to the logical side. Why? Because if I save it from the physical side, the next time I open this model, it's going to open onto the physical side. And I would prefer that it open onto the logical side, kind of focusing on that do the logical first idea. So we've got our logical side Model Explorer back. Notice, by the way, in key groups, and this would have been the same on the physical side, there's XPK Publisher. Now our members branch has got a member, Publisher Identification. I'm going to collapse the Publisher branch. And then from the File menu, just select Save. Next time, we'll create some relationships representing the ways that we allow these entities to interact. I'll see you then. Well, it's beginning to look like a little tiny data model shaped thing, isn't it? Let's begin to capture some business rules for how we allow these entities to interact. There was a time when data models looked very much like this. You can imagine this with about 2,000 entities. Now we're going to create some relationships among our entities. We have a business rule that each publisher creates 0, 1, or more books. So let me open up a little space here between publisher and book. I think I can safely zoom out a couple of steps, still be able to see that. I'm going to use the Erwin DM toolbox to create a relationship between publisher and book. I'm going to use a dash line relationship for this, a non-identifying relationship. So I push the dash line button in the Erwin DM toolbox. And notice my cursor image again has changed to a dashed line relationship picture, but it's kind of tiny. And it's got a little tiny box or a handle up at the top left corner. When I move my cursor down above an entity, the image changes on the cursor. Now, instead of that black handle-looking box, I get a starburst. And I know what that means. For a new relationship, start here. Click. Now, I'm not dragging this line. In fact, I've taken my hand off the cursor. What we do is click once to launch the relationship, and then click again to land it. Notice the cursor image changing. The cursor image is your guide to what's coming up next. There we go. And left click. Notice the primary key migrated. Publisher identification, FK. It migrated and became a foreign key in book. I also see that by default, this is an optional relationship. Each publisher is associated with 0, 1, or more books. Each book is associated with 0 or 1 publishers. Well, that may be true, but I'm pretty mistrustful of nulls. I don't think I want a nullable relationship being my default. We'll see where to change that a little bit later, once we get into the editors. We also have a rule that each author writes some number of books, or maybe no books at all. But also each book is written by at least one author, but it could be 2, could be 10. Right now, at the logical level, our current knowledge of the system is that we don't know enough to say anything except there's a many-to-many logical relationship between author and book. So I'll push the many-to-many relationship button in the Irwin DM toolbox. That's with a little crow's foot on each end of the relationship line. Now, the wording of this relationship is that each author writes 0, 1, or more books. I guess you could say that each book is written by some number of authors, but I'm going to prefer, this is not a hard and fast rule, it just makes things easier later on. I'm going to pick the active side of that relationship, which is each author writes 0, 1, or more books. Each book is written by 0, 1, or more authors. That would be called passive, is written by. But each author writes is active. So now with my relationship tool, I'm going to click first on author, not dragging, point my cursor to book, and click again. No foreign key migration between author and book. Well, which way would it go? And how many times would it reproduce itself? If we were migrating author identification into book, we'd have to tell book, well, we might have as many as 17 authors for one book. So we need 17 relationships. No, that's not happening. I wonder what's going on. I wonder how this many-to-many relationship is treated on the physical side of our model. Let's go take a peek. I'm going to flip over to the physical side with the logical physical toggle up in the toolbars. Authored book. I'd like to straighten out these relationship lines. Notice as I move my cursor across the relationship line, I get a little move cursor. And I can click on any segment of that relationship line. So I'm going to click on this vertical segment here, drag it over and kind of match it up with the other vertical segment. And now there's only one continuous relationship line from author into author book. Likewise, I'm going to drag the other one-to-many relationship, the one that's between book and author book, over to the left just so it's not crossing underneath anything. Author book is called an association or associative entity or table, sometimes a join table. It associates specific authors with specific books. Each instance of author book has to have a unique combination of author identification and book identification. So how many authors can write one book? As many as you want, because each instance of the association will have a different author identification and the same book identification. And it works just the same for how many books can one author write. Well, as many as we want. This automatic resolution of many-to-many relationships is a handy feature of Irwin Data Modeler. Let's go back to the logical side. Yeah, well, now we begin to see some differences between the logical side of the model and the physical side of our combined logical physical model. And we built a couple of relationships among our entities. I think that'll do us for now. Let's build some views. First, we'll build a simple view to control privacy of author information. To prepare, note we have a new diagram to work with. It's labeled Views. Notice we're on the physical side of our model, and look what's happened to the Irwin toolbox. The many-to-many relationship button is gone, but we have a new button in its place called a View Relationship, and also the third button from the left is a View button. Let's use that button to create a new view. Click on it, and somewhere down here by the bottom right corner of our existing diagram, let's drop a new view. I'm going to rename it V _ Author _ Privacy. So there's a brand new view. It has no columns, so it's not going to be much use to us. To build view columns, let's populate it with some copies of columns that are in the author table. We'll want author identification, the primary key of author. We also want author last name and author first name. I'm holding down the control key and just clicking on these to select them. When I grab hold of these three selections and drag them into the view that we've just created, Irwin knows I don't want to delete them, I don't want to relocate them. I'm making copies of the information into the new view. So let's just drag and position that horizontal insert bar in our new view. Drop them right there. Notice we get a new relationship line. It's a dotted line. It's not like any we've seen before. It's just a representation of the relationship between author, a base table here, and our view. Next, let's build a two-table view that shows limited specific information about publishers and the books they produce. Once again, back to the toolbox, click a view table, and we'll drop that at the other bottom corner. And underneath publisher there, we have some open space. Once again, I'll rename this as V _ or underbar, publisher _ book. Now let's populate that similar to the way we did with author. We'll begin with the publisher table. We want publisher information, publisher name, and publisher zip code. Control clicking, dragging, and dropping to get our references from the view columns back to the base table publisher. We're also going to have this view include some columns about books. So we select the book table, and then inside it we'll collect book identification, book name, and book type. Drag these down, position the horizontal insert below the publisher information, and there we go. You can straighten the relationship lines either by right-clicking them and selecting Reset Relationship Path, or you can grab hold of the individual segments and reposition the lines just to clean things up. So now we have V Publisher Book, a view that we can use to help us select books and their publishers just from dragging and dropping. Well, hooray! We've used Irwin Data Modeler's most fundamental capabilities to get our model started. We have a few entities, a few attributes, and a few relationships. We built them with on-screen editing using the Irwin DM toolbox and the Model Explorer. You'll probably use these capabilities frequently with Irwin DM because they're just so handy. However, entities, attributes, and relationships have many properties that you can't create or edit, not easily at least, in the Model Explorer. And on-screen editing gives us access only to the very most basic properties like the names of entities, the names of attributes, and verb phrases for relationships. Still, on-screen editing is very handy, really, I think, to me, in two situations. First situation, I have a huge flurry of the same kind of objects I need to create, need to build. or I need to do one little thing to an existing entity or attribute or relationship. At both extremes, that's when I find the Irwin DM toolbox and the Model Explorer for on-screen editing to be most handy. The Introduction to Irwin Data Modeler course. This is the first in a series of Irwin Data Modeler tool training. I mentioned some of these others to you just to point out that, yes, we'll be getting more detail about this or that issue or item that we've taken a look at in the introduction course. Thank you for participating.